In April 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. The Allies had crossed the Rhine in the west, were advancing through northern Italy, and stood on the brink of delivering the final blow to the Third Reich. Nevertheless, Hitler refused to accept reality. Instead of surrendering, he relocated his last reserves to the east, hoping to halt the advance of the Red Army. This documentary uses archival footage, eyewitness accounts, and modern technology to shed light on the final days of the Battle of Berlin, one of the most devastating urban battles of the 20th century. On April 16th, the Soviet Army launched the so-called Berlin Operation. The goal was to cross the Oder and Neisse rivers and encircle Berlin completely. The UdSSR had amassed an enormous force for this purpose: 2.5 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces and aircraft. The offensive was primarily carried out by two fronts: the First Belarusian Front under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konev. Despite overwhelming military superiority, resistance was fierce. About 1 million German soldiers were positioned for defense, many poorly armed, poorly trained, and exhausted. Still, they offered bitter resistance, especially at the Silo Heights, about 60 kilometers east of Berlin. Intense fighting raged there for 4 days, costing the Soviets over 66,000 soldiers. It wasn't until April 21st that the Red Army finally broke through the lines and continued advancing toward the capital. South of Zhukov's troops, Konev's front advanced more rapidly. Stalin abruptly changed the plan and ordered Konev to also move directly on Berlin. On April 25th, the two fronts met. Berlin was now fully encircled. The situation in the city was catastrophic. Refugees poured into Berlin. Food and medical supplies were scarce. Many of the approximately 2.5 million remaining civilians sought shelter in basements, while artillery bombardments raged above them. The city had been divided into defensive zones. At the center lay the so-called Z-Zone, the last stronghold around the government district. But the defenses were mostly improvised barricades, rubble protection, and poorly armed fighters, including Hitler Youth, Volkssturm militia, and remnants of regular units. Still, Berlin was a difficult target to capture. Numerous waterways, bridges, and massive stone buildings offered excellent cover. The Soviets attacked with brutal firepower. Heavy howitzers pulverized resistance points before infantry, and tanks moved in to secure the ground. The urban combat was relentless, fought street by street. Particular focus was placed on the city center. The fiercely contested area around the Reichstag stretched from the Landwehr Canal to the Spree. Here stood the Chancellery, the Reich Air Ministry, the Gestapo headquarters, and Hitler's Führerbunker. In these underground shelters, the last Nazi leaders clung to power. Hitler would commit suicide there on April 30th. The main objective of the Red Army, however, was the Reichstag. Although politically irrelevant since the 1933 fire, Soviet propaganda portrayed the building as the symbol of the Nazi regime, the heart of fascism. Stalin demanded that a red flag be raised on it before May 1st. Access led via the former Königsplatz, today's Platz der Republik. At the time, the area was a field of rubble. In the center lay a flooded subway construction site that served as a defensive line. Surrounding the square were destroyed buildings: the Interior Ministry, the Kroll Opera House, the Diplomatic Quarter. Only a few structures, like the Swiss Embassy, survived the battle. On April 28th, the Third Shock Army of the Red Army, under General Vasily Kuznetsov, reached the Reichstag's vicinity. The 150th Rifle Division was ordered to capture the Moltke Bridge, a strategically vital crossing over the Spree. But the bridge was mined, heavily fortified, and covered by German troops positioned in the Interior Ministry and nearby buildings. The first assault was repelled under heavy fire. A second attempt with Stalin II tanks ended in disaster as Soviet vehicles exploded under precise German fire. The cause, a flak tower in the Berlin Zoo, one of three massive concrete structures armed with 128mm guns, had the bridge in its sights. Eventually, despite heavy losses, the Soviets managed to partially secure the Moltke Bridge. They brought in artillery to bombard the Interior Ministry and the diplomatic quarter. Room by room, they fought their way forward until both complexes were captured on April 29th. The path to the Reichstag was now clear. Early on the morning of April 30th, the final assault on the Reichstag began. Soviet troops had to cross nearly 300 meters of open ground, crisscrossed with trenches, littered with debris, and covered by machine guns, 88mm cannons, and other defensive positions. The first Soviet push at 4:30 a.m. was halted under heavy fire. A second attempt around 11:30 a.m. also failed. Only in the afternoon were Soviet units able to partially cross the open area and reach the building. Support came from guns near Lehrter Bahnhof, now Washingtonplatz, which bombarded the Reichstag to suppress German fire. Roughly 300 German soldiers still held the building. Among them was the young Gunter Debski, who later recalled how his officer wanted to send him out with a white flag, but the order was never carried out, as the officer was fatally shot shortly thereafter. On the Soviet side, pressure was mounting. Stalin demanded a clear sign of victory by May 1st. After a false report on April 30th wrongly claimed the flag had already been raised, assault teams were formed to break into the building at all costs. Around 6 p.m., troops from the 756th Rifle Regiment finally broke through the front facade. Soviet Sergeant Ilya Sianov later described the scene inside. Confusion, the din of battle, gunfire and screams echoing through a vast, dark building, parts of which were burning. It was difficult to find one's bearings. The interior, a maze of corridors, stairways, and rooms. Bit by bit, the Soviets secured the ground floor. Some German defenders fled to the upper floors, others into the basement. Brutal close quarters fighting ensued. Artillery was again used, both externally against the upper levels, and by German guns inside targeting Soviet positions on the ground floor. The fighting continued throughout the night. Sometime in the early hours of May 1st, a red flag was likely first raised on the building, probably improvised above the main entrance. But it wasn't until May 2nd that the last defenders of the Reichstag surrendered. The battle had lasted more than 30 hours. The famous photo by Yevgeny Kaldai, showing a Soviet soldier raising a red flag atop the Reichstag, became iconic, but it was staged. It was likely taken on May 2nd. Notably, the soldier originally wore 2 watches, evidence of looting, which was later edited out of the image. Casualties were immense on both sides. An estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Soviet soldiers died in the Battle of Berlin. On the German side, similar numbers were killed. In addition, about 20,000 civilians lost their lives. When the first Western reporters arrived, they documented not only the destruction, but also the victors' traces. Soviet soldiers had carved their names into the walls of the Reichstag, a symbol of the final collapse of the Nazi regime. But Berlin's story did not end with the military victory.
For some reason, Stalin believed that he was special, that even though Hitler had violated every agreement, even though Hitler had invaded all these countries, that somehow he would not have invaded the Soviet Union.
In the months that followed, the city became a focal point of the emerging Cold War. The division of Berlin would shape geopolitical tensions for decades. Today, the city is almost unrecognizable. Modern glass facades and new architecture obscure much of what happened in 1945. But those who look closely can still find traces: a damaged griffin on the Moltke Bridge, faded lettering on the Reichstag's roof, remnants of Soviet graffiti, or the memorials honoring those who lost their lives in the final days of the Second World War.